also have measures of contractility, preload, and afterload, and can use the appropriate medications. These three parameters determine stroke volume times heart rate gives us cardiac output. So all of these measurements made by hemodynamic monitoring allow us to optimize the blood flow. Also, we look at the oxygen delivery. Oxygen delivery is determined by cardiac output times arterial oxygen content. Now, arterial oxygen content is a constant times hemoglobin times SpO2. These numbers don't really change beat to beat, so they're almost like a constant for a small time period. And because of that, it's a constant, we often replace oxygen delivery with cardiac output. We never talk about oxygen delivery methods. We talk about cardiac output methods, and that's the reason. We talk about cardiac output methods, and one of the traditional old-fashioned methods is thermodilution. So thermodilution works that a catheter is put through the venous system, through the, so the idea of the thermodilution method is that a catheter, usually referred as the Swan-Ganz catheter, is put through the venous system, through the right atrium, right ventricle, into the pulmonary artery. And then a cold saline solution is induced, and a thermistor, somewhere sitting here at the end of the catheter tip, is measuring how fast the blood is cooling down the temperature. And typical thermodilution curves look like this for the normal cardiac output and for a low cardiac output. Now, this is a highly invasive method, and it can cause arrhythmia and needs a lot of expertise and skills. So at least in the United States and Germany, it's not anymore that often practiced. An alternative method, also thermodilution method, is the so-called transpulmonary thermodilution, where also a cold solution is injected, but the measurement with a thermistor is happening in the pulmonary, in the aorta. So the whole fluid goes through the lungs too before it is measured. Also highly invasive. Okay, very good. Muchísimas gracias. There are also indicator dilution methods, which, for example, inject lithium chloride into the right side of the heart and then measure in the radial artery the concentration of the lithium chloride. So also a highly invasive method, also adding foreign substances to the body. Nowadays, more common, at least in the adult world, is the so-called pulse contour method. Basically, it measures either non-invasively or invasively an arterial pressure waveform, and then this arterial pressure waveform is interpreted with the area on the curve and certain shapes and slopes to determine flow from a pressure waveform. This by itself is needs a lot of algorithm adjustment to make it work. And it's questionable how well this works when the systemic vascular resistance is changed. A method which I will talk about later today is electrocardiometry. This method basically applies an electrical current of high frequency, 50 kilohertz, to the outer electrodes of the body. Through the inner electrodes, the resulting signal is measured. And if you apply 50 kilohertz, you also receive 50 kilohertz plus the signal of interest. Engineers call this process of filtering out the 50 kilohertz demodulation. After demodulation, the device obtains the ECG and the electrical bioimpedance, both resistance part and the reactance part. Okay, that's very technical. And here just a small explanation when we talk about impedance. Impedance has two components, resistance and reactance. And that's a typical property of biological tissue. So when the impedance changes, the resistance and at the same time the reactance changes. Okay, or you can also express this in phase and magnitude. And these are the equations to determine magnitude and phase out of resistance and reactance. And you have two options. You can use the magnitude to create a signal like this here, which resembles an arterial pressure waveform, or you can use the phase too. Different methods use different ways. But in essence, the idea is always to obtain a waveform which is very similar to an arterial pressure waveform. Another method quite often used is Doppler velocimetry or ultrasound. Here you have a probe which has a transmitting and a receiving element, and based on the blood flow and the velocity of the blood flow, you get a signal very much like this one here. And then you can put a curve around the signal and determine the so-called systemic velocity integral. Now, this area under the curve times the cross-sectional area of the aorta gives you stroke volume. To make this relatively accurate, you have to keep the probe in a certain angle at the body. You have to find the maximum blood flow, and you also need to know the cross-sectional area of the aorta, which is usually estimated. All these methods measure cardiac output, but there are a couple of things which are interesting to you. We put here a graph, we put the accuracy over invasive towards non-invasive methods. And obviously, the most accurate method to measure cardiac output is the magnetic resonance imaging. Great. Put this MRI system next to the bedside of the patient. That's a little more difficult. Other methods like pulmonary artery catheterization or transpulmonary thermolution are probably relatively accurate but highly invasive. Pulse contour method is still invasive. Sometimes the marketing calls it minimal invasive. It's still invasive and has reduced accuracy compared to these methods. And then you have Doppler ultrasound, which, depending on the user, gives accurate or, so accurate results. Electrocardiometry has maybe some limitations in a few patients, but it's a very non-invasive, an absolutely non-invasive method. Another consideration is nowadays, because healthcare is very expensive, is the costs or the cost effectiveness. And MRI is extremely costly. You have the invasive methods, which have relatively expensive disposal material. You have Doppler, which is non-invasive and reasonable in costs, but with very low cost and completely non-invasive is electrocardiometry. So when we look at the methods, we have to see, are they applicable? For example, an adult undergoing hip replacement, and maybe this adult is already an elderly person, has heart problems, you wouldn't put an arterial line into this patient. So you have to consider applicability and justify which method is used best. Okay, let's talk about hemodynamics and what electrocardiometry brings to you. So every hemodynamic monitor gives you flow, stroke volume or stroke index, and cardiac output or cardiac index. And with knowing the blood pressure, you can determine the systemic vascular resistance according to this equation. Electrocardiometry adds to that the thoracic fluid content and also an index of contractility. And it is presented like this. So you have here the flow parameters, resistance, thoracic fluid content, and an index of contractility. And since some of these parameters are not very common and not used in other systems, they're unique to electrocardiometry, the system provides you with a normal range. So everything within the center of these bar diagrams is kind of normal, at least according to statistics, and everything exceeding that is high or low. How does electrocardiometry actually work? When you hook up the system to a patient, you obtain the surface ECG, and then this waveform here, the change of impedance waveform, which looks like an arterial pressure waveform. Ignore for now this waveform. That's an engineering signal. It's an artificial signal. It's used for analysis of this waveform here. Now, prior to aortic valve opening, the red blood cells in the aorta have a random orientation. This is Mother Nature. As soon as the aortic valve opens, the red blood cells align with their flat side in parallel with the blood flow. Now, if you measure with electrodes over the aorta the impedance of this of the aorta, the electrical current has to circumvene the red blood cells in this case. When the aortic valve opens, the electrical current can go straight by these red blood cells. That's kind of a simple approach, but that's basically how it works. So the difference from here, from this waveform, from the bottom to the top, this slope is basically caused by this phenomenon from random orientation to aligned orientation of the red blood cells in the aorta. What does it mean? Well, the steeper the slope here, and you see the slope beat to beat, no matter if it's an adult, a child, or neonate. The steeper the slope, the faster the alignment of red blood cells. That means the higher the contractility of the heart. So basically, measuring this slope here, which equates to this peak of the waveform, is a measure of the contractility of electrocardiometry. How is stroke volume calculated? Well, relatively straightforward. Stroke volume is a patient constant, which is determined by height and weight of the patient. It then requires a mean velocity during flow time, FT stands for flow time, which we derive from the impedance waveform. And then we need the actual flow time, which more or less equates left ventricular ejection time. So a constant time mean velocity times flow time equals stroke volume. Here an overview about what the system is capable. We have thoracic fluid content, basically determines any excessive fluids in the thorax, for example, the lungs. We measure the flow. With knowing the mean arterial pressure and the central venous pressure, we can determine the systemic vascular resistance. We can estimate the preload by knowing either stroke volume variation or a change in stroke volume or the corrected flow time. And we obtain an index of contractility. Let's talk about the thoracic fluid content. The thoracic fluid content, or an excess of it, can be determined either by intravascular or intercellular fluids, or by fluids sitting in the lungs, or pleural effusion, or interstitial fluids. So the thoracic fluid content is not specific, very important, but it's highly sensitive. As soon as a patient has somewhere thorax excess fluids, this number goes up. And if you don't know the patient well enough, let's say in the emergency room, you have to use echo to figure out where are the fluids sitting. That's an example of a patient with pleural effusion. Basically, fluids are sitting below the lungs, and you can see in the X-ray that's a normal patient, a patient with pleural effusion, an increased white area. But again, that's X-ray. With electrocardiometry, you have the results within 2 minutes, including putting the electrodes on. Okay, so TFC can be seen as a parameter which gives you some kind of a risk analysis of adding more fluids. Because isn't that very often the case? You're not sure, should I add fluids to the patient, to the circulation or not? And if the system provides you with a high number of TFC, you have to be extra careful. If the number is normal, within normal range, the risk of adding more fluid is probably less. Yeah, let's quickly look at the Frank Sterling curve. These are curves for different patients. That's a patient with normal contractility, high and low contractility. And the idea is we have on the horizontal axis the preload, and on the y-axis the stroke volume. A patient who is not in need of volume, and let's look at this normal patient here, probably is somewhere here. So if you add more preload, the stroke volume here does not really change. A patient who's in dire need of volume probably sits somewhere here below. So if you increase the preload, the stroke volume will increase too. So measuring the stroke volume while you add more preload is a very good method to see if a patient responds to volume. So which methods are used at least in the adult world? Well, either you add some bolus and measure while you give the bonus the cardiac output or the stroke volume, or you perform a passive leg raise test. A passive leg raise test works that the patient is initially in a supine or lightly elevated position with the upper body. You take a baseline of stroke volume, stroke index, then you or some helper raises the legs, not the patient, and you monitor stroke volume too. And if stroke volume increases by about 15% or more, this patient most likely requires volume or would benefit from volume. Electrocardiometry also provides two dynamic parameters. One of them is stroke volume variation. So, excuse me. If stroke volume variation is less than 10%, basically the patient doesn't need volume. Very nice. If stroke volume exceeds 15%, well, it depends. If the patient is ventilated, you can surely say this patient would benefit from more volume. If the patient is not ventilated, you cannot be sure because as the tidal volume changes, stroke volume changes due to respiration, you don't know exactly by the number, so you have to use your experience, which is required anyway, to see if the patient needs more volume. But at least low stroke volume variation indicates no need for volume. The other parameter is the corrected flow time. If the flow time is foreshortened and the systemic vascular resistance is normal, it's also a dynamic indicator for lack of volume. If the corrected flow time is within normal range, you wouldn't add volume. So these are two parameters which are basically offered by the system free of charge. They're dynamic, you can look at them, and if you really have to verify if volume is needed or not, you can, for example, perform a passive leg raise test. But these two parameters are monitored continuously. Okay, now it's getting more interesting, less technical. That's a 2-year-old girl, so we go over some case studies, a 2-year-old girl with pulmonary hypertension in a big US American hospital. And initially, she had a cardiac index of 2 liters per minute per meter squared, a very low index of contractility for a child, 20 to 25. The systemic vascular resistance was high, and the TFC, thoracic fluid content, was slightly elevated, but not super high. Stroke volume variation was measured to 23 to 26%, very high, and corrected flow time was low. What would you do? Based on the stroke volume variation, in the adult world, you would add volume. Looking at the TFC, you can say, well, it's elevated, but not super high. So my risk of adding volume is probably manageable. There was a couple of minutes of discussion, and then it was decided to give 50 milliliters of saline solution. Within about 4 minutes, the parameters changed the following way. The cardiac index increased by 20%. The index of contractility increased too, now with more volume in the circulation. The resistance didn't change. Stroke volume variation came down from 25% to about 15%. And corrected flow time did not change within 4 minutes. Now, I think that is quite an improvement of the hemodynamics within 4 minutes. Also interesting, of course, the patient was monitored continuously with cardiometry. Even after 30 minutes, the TFC didn't change, which tells us that the additional fluid, the 50 milliliters which were given, didn't go somewhere into the static fluids. They really stayed within the circulation. Not all the times you see such a success, but that's an example where the patient immediately benefited from the therapy. I want to talk about a relatively recent study from India. It's about pediatric patients in unresolved shock condition. And especially in countries where there's not a very developed healthcare system in every city of the country, septic shock is usually a cause of morbidity and mortality in children. And sepsis, as you probably know much better than I do as an engineer, there are multiple mechanisms. It can be vasodilation, capillary leak, and myocardial dysfunction. And they can occur all at the same time or just one. And they can also change over time. And the usual static measures don't really reflect the dynamic process. So in this study, they did the following protocol. They said, okay, we start with our septic children. Initially, about 38, 5 were excluded, leaving 33 patients. Then on 3 patients, there were no reliable readings. At the end, they ended up with 30 patients. And they took electrocardiometry to measure cardiac index and systemic vascular resistance index. So these numbers here, or this classification, was done by using electrocardiometry numbers. And on 14 patients were determined to be vasoconstricted based on electrocardiometry. And 10 of them were fluid responsive and 4 not. On the patients with a high cardiac index and low resistance, called vasodilated, we had 6 patients which were fluid responsive and 10 patients not being fluid responsive. And when you put this into a graph, the usual differentiation between cold shock and warm shock really didn't help much. So just by basically touching legs, figuring out cold shock and warm shock, it doesn't tell you if a patient is a responder to volume giving or not. So as a conclusion, the authors stated that by using electrocardiometry, they can categorize their patients much better and can determine which patient needs fluids and which patient doesn't. And they also said it's a real-time measurement. So it's not something which takes a lot of time, and they can, by just measuring cardiac index and systemic vascular resistance, they can titrate the medication or the volume giving much better than just based on the assessment of cold and warm shock. A similar, or not a similar study, but a study using electrocardiometry in neonates was done in Italy, also in 2021, and they came to a similar conclusion. The simple classification of cold shock and warm shock is not as helpful as hemodynamic measurement. Now, in our company, we have a team of clinical people headed by an MD PhD. And very often we get screenshots from our monitor asking us, what would you do in this case based on these parameters? And that's a service which is basically available almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this is what I'm showing you in the next 4 slides, is basically how our clinical team responds to the questions, or how we do our analysis. First of all, very important, electrocardiometry measures thoracic fluid content, the blood within the circulation, contractility, pre-load and after load. But in addition to that, we ask for laboratory measurements, for any other vital signs, for urine output, and any other fluid levels. Further on, we have to ask, because we don't know if it's a patient with or without medication, we have to ask for the medications applied and any other observations. So very important, all things have to be considered. The first parameter our team looks at, primera consideración, is the thoracic fluid content. So if the thoracic fluid content is normal, great. If it's high, the questions are, any infection? Do we have any additional fluids in the pleura, in the lung system? And if that is the case, we want to know, how is this measured? Were there additional methods used to determine the location of the excess thoracic fluids? So that's basically the first question. Once we have answered that, the next question is, we look for cardiac index and systemic vascular resistance. So let's look at the 2 most frequently happening situations. We have a low cardiac index and high systemic vascular resistance, something which occurs more likely in children than adults. And based on that, we can determine, for example, in which direction the pedenization is heading, in which direction of shock. On the other side, we have high cardiac index and low systemic vascular resistance, so an indicator, for example, of a warm sepsis. Less often do we have cardiac index low and low systemic vascular resistance. That's, for example, a situation of cold sepsis, or the opposite, both parameters high, which could be hypertension or acute renal infarction. The next step is volume management. Okay, we look at our dynamic parameters, see what we can learn from stroke volume variation and corrected flow time. If stroke volume variation is low, less than 12% adults, less than 9% neonates, the patient doesn't need fluid. If stroke volume variation is high, we look, is the patient ventilated or not? Does the patient have arrhythmia? And if the patient is not ventilated, we cannot make an assumption based on these parameters. We have to do a passive leg raise test or give a bolus. If corrected flow time is normal and we have a normal systemic vascular resistance, no fluids need to be given either. So it's basically always some kind of a flow chart. And the last consideration is we look at the trend of the index of contractility. So if the index of contractility is low and stays low through therapy, and the systemic vascular resistance is not increased, then we probably have a situation of compromised cardiac function. So as a summary, electrocardiometry gives you a pretty good overview about the various parameters related to the circulation in the heart, from flow, afterload, preload, and contractility towards the very important parameter of thoracic fluid content. And including the time it takes to put these sensors on, that takes about 2 minutes. Now, it is not only the cooperation between you physicians and industry or companies. Just this week, we discussed with Carlos Andres, the head of our distributor Electromedica, that here in Colombia, there's so much talent, but maybe not enough opportunities to use this talent. So we said, well, in Berlin, Germany, we need software engineers, systems engineers. So why not giving people here, young or whoever is familiar with software development or programming, a chance to come to join our company. Most of our software engineers work from home. So this person who's interested could come for a year to Berlin, Germany, get trained, get educated according to our quality system, which is nowadays very important, even in software development, and then could even return to Colombia and keep working for us. Now, if you know anyone who's interested, let us or Carlos Andres know, and I can assure you, Berlin has 2 Colombian restaurants. So this person would be on the safe side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, thank you very much, Dr. Osipka, for your interesting talk. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
¿Esto qué tanta posibilidad tiene de compararse con los otros monitores que tenemos, como el Swan-Ganz o con el FlowTrack en adultos y en niños?
About the concordance of the correlation or concordance of the traditional methods to monitoring the cardiac output, like FlowTrack or pulmonary artery catheter.
The accuracy is approximately the same. We talk usually about accuracy and precision. Precision is the way how well can we reproduce the same measurement. And all impedance technologies are extremely precise. So if you repeat the measurement, for example, before or after passive leg raise test, you get more or less exactly the same numbers. accuracy in general as good as Swan-Ganz, which has its own inaccuracy, or flow track system. Flow track system determines the flow from blood pressure. It's not an independent measurement. So it has its own inaccuracy. So in general, both methods have approximately the same accuracy.
¿Sobre alguna otra pregunta?
Sí, Luis.
Siga, doctor Barona.
El paciente idealmente debe estar intubado, extubado, si es cirugía de cardio y está el tórax abierto. ¿Tiene alguna limitante?
About the use in patients with open thorax or patients with mechanical ventilation or spontaneous ventilation, what are the conditions to optimize the measurement and the accuracy of the measurement of the cardiac output and the other parameters?
Excellent question. So first of all, measurements during, let's say, cardiac surgery, open thorax, are a contraindication. Not so much because the system doesn't work, it works, but with all the fluid changes and maybe even material inside the thorax, we cannot guarantee that the measurements are accurate. So usually during cardiac surgery, you have arterial lines which take over with the flow track system, for example, the cardiac output measurement. Electrocardiometry is not replacing flow track, okay? Wherever you have an arterial line, I would use the flow track and do the measurements this way. Now, once the thorax is closed, you can continue with electrocardiometry. Normal ventilation is not an issue at all. Where the problem is if you have, for example, neonates with high frequency ventilation, basically the neonate laying on a little mattress which vibrates at a high rate. That does not work because, I mean, imagine, electrocardiometry measures the alignment of red blood cells. This is a Purkinje signal, okay? If the patient is moved or is talking or is agitating, you get noises or artifacts into the signal which are much higher than the signal of interest. So in order to perform a proper measurement of cardiometry, the patient has to be at rest and quiet. But ventilation otherwise is not an issue.
Thank you. I know you might have the number. What is the mean difference with the pulmonary artery catheter in experimental animals or something like that, where you measure at the same time the cardiac output with pulmonary artery catheter and with cardiometry?
Yes, the early studies which we had to present it to the US FDA for accepting of a market use of a system showed between Swan-Ganz catheter or the PICO system, usually correlations in the range of 0.78 and an agreement or an error which was less than about 30%. I think 30% is kind of the theoretical number. You say, do two systems agree with their numbers? We have on our website about 100 plus publications. Some of them, and they are kind of sorted, show the agreement or accuracy of our system compared to other systems. But there are several studies showing very good agreement, especially if their studies were done properly. Some studies, as it always happens, you know, they just published something without any control of us, and they didn't turn out that well. But in general, we have excellent results.
Thank you. Bueno, si me permite, voy a hacer un resumen como de todas las cosas que van de la charla. Es un sistema mínimamente invasivo porque usa unos electrodos que ustedes vieron cómo se ponen. El dispositivo es el que está a la izquierda y en la pantalla aparecen todos esos datos que él nos mostró. el TFC, ¿cierto? Todo lo que tiene que ver con el stroke volume, el índice de contractilidad, la resistencia sistémica. O sea, todo eso lo tienen que, aparece a partir de cómo están alineados los glóbulos rojos, si están en una manera desorganizada o organizada. Y por eso es una señal muy, muy leve, muy suave, que el aparato pues la logra detectar, y por eso se afecta por estados como el tórax abierto, como dice, no tiene probabilidad, o sea, es mala idea pues si tiene tórax abierto, o si tiene sistemas que tengan mucho artefacto, como que esté bajo ventilación de alta frecuencia o alguna cosa que tenga mucho artefacto en la medición eléctrica o de la impedancia pues del cuerpo. O sea, en general la ventilación no lo afecta y permite incluso medir esto del TFC, que es para ver cómo está decongestionado de agua el pulmón. Sobre la precisión, dice que la reproducibilidad de la medición es muy alta. Ellos son ingenieros que adaptaron esto de la biomedicina de la ingeniería, nos traen esto a la medicina, y pues dice que la reproducibilidad es muy alta, como de medición 1 con 1, y que la comparación con otros sistemas es muy precisa. Recordemos que el gasto cardíaco medido por catéter de arteria pulmonar tiene su propio error como tal, igual el flow track, igual la termodilución. Entonces, en estos sistemas, cada que uno va a comparar una cosa con otra, se acepta una variabilidad entre uno y otro método del 30%, y él cabe en ese espacio, digamos, de manera que es aceptable como método de medición. Incluso tiene validada la FDA, ¿cierto? Tiene FDA approved. This device is FDA approved.
FDA approved in Canada, Japan, Europe, and many other countries, yes.
Okay. So
approved not only for use on adults, but also on children and explicitly neonates.
Wow, y tiene también, debe tener INVIMA también, supongo, pues, pero, o a menos que no tenga INVIMA, pero sí, cierto. Tiene INVIMA también, y tiene FDA aprobado en Canadá, Japón, en toda la ciudad, el mundo. Y tiene no solamente para adultos, sino también para niños desde 700 gramos, que eso es lo que más nos interesa. Digamos, esta tecnología la queremos mostrar, y contamos con la gran suerte de que está pues acá el mismísimo pues diseñador del aparato, porque la multimodalidad en la monitoría es lo que hace que tengamos una mejor acercamiento al estado de realidad del paciente. La multimodalidad es lo único que podemos tener para acercarnos a un diagnóstico preciso. Si varias pruebas diferentes que van a un mismo diagnóstico van hacia una misma dirección, pues digamos, el diagnóstico es más preciso, ¿cierto? Y nos permite hacernos una imagen más general del paciente, y podemos hacer más terapias pues dirigidas a resolver lo que tenga el paciente. Si le falta pues en este caso fluido, o si tiene un gasto cardíaco bajo que le falta inotrópico, o si tiene mucha agua en el pulmón, pues todo ese tipo de cosas tenemos que analizarlas. Entonces pues esa era como la idea de la charla, y pues fantástico que nos pudo acompañar el doctor. ¿Cómo se pone? Básicamente se ponen dos electrodos acá. ¿Tienes, Carlos, tiene chance de mostrarnos el...? Ah, bueno, acá ellos... Bueno, ¿alguien más está pidiendo la palabra? El doctor Ariza, por favor, que siga.
Gracias, doctor Luis. Interesting technology. I have some question about if these variables or assessment are related or change with the acute change in hemoglobin or blood rheology. Have you had any analysis on that?
We haven't conducted or came across any clinical study, but there are some early studies from the 1980s which look at the electrical properties of flowing blood. And there's one study where the hemoglobin was changed artificially. And it showed that, at least within a relatively good range of hemoglobin concentration, the shape of the waveform did not change. That means the slope we are looking at, beat to beat, remained the same, independent of the hemoglobin concentration. So our conclusion from that is that no matter if 100 blood cells get an orientation or 1,000, the shape of the waveform does not differ, and thus the measurement should remain the same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doctor Gastón, por favor, la pregunta. Otra pregunta del auditorio virtual. ¿Alguien está levantando la mano? Bueno, sobre la pregunta del doctor Ariza, es si hay algún cambio con las propiedades de radiología de la sangre. Y pues él dice como que no, los estudios fisiológicos muestran que no hay tanta alteración en la deformidad del glóbulo rojo con respecto al flujo y que por eso puede ser aceptable en esos cambios, pero que todavía están como en estudio pues otros cambios como la parte de la coagulación o otros cambios pues más como de la hemodilución y estas cosas que por supuesto son muy importantes en la forma del glóbulo rojo, ¿cierto?
Okay, maybe I can quickly come back to the question how the electrodes are placed. So there are 4 electrodes, 4 stickers to say it simply, which are placed on the left side of the neck. The electrode B, which is the lower, is like the onset of the neck, and the other electrode about center to center 5 centimeters above. And the other 2 electrodes are placed on the excipient level, lateral, and then about 5 to 7 centimeters below. Very simple assessment. If there's any volunteer, we can
Voluntario que nos
do a
ayude.
quick demonstration how it works.
El doctor Jaramillo que está que...
Oh, all I'm scared. Okay, yeah, well.
Ayúdanos pues todo. Frecuencia cardíaca, el TFC, de allí. Todos al de ahí. Ah, se ve de mal. Qué pena. No. Tengo que ir a resonancia. Claro. Entonces, mientras terminamos de hacer el setup acá, la idea es que como funciona desde los 700 gramos en bebés hasta adultos, pues es una herramienta muy dinámica, sobre todo que en la población pediátrica no tenemos acceso a muchas herramientas validadas. El catéter arterial pulmonar y todo lo que tiene que ver con la onda de pulso no tiene mucha reproducibilidad en los niños ni se ha adaptado. Ni hay catéteres pues para eso. Hay, pero pues digamos no se consiguen mucho y la edad pues 30 kilos para arriba digamos es que funcionan. De abajo pues muy difícil. Y en los niños pues dejar las líneas arteriales izquierdas o otras monitorías de gasto cardíaco se vuelve un problema por la invasividad pues tan grande que hay que hacer, ¿cierto? Sin embargo, pues este tipo de cosas, junto con otras cosas pues que tenemos en la monitoría, pues podemos tenerlas como en el armamentario para poder hacer el diagnóstico completo, ¿cierto? Entonces acá están haciendo miren cómo se pone en el cuello, en el lado derecho, ahí al lado izquierdo en este caso, a nivel pues de la línea digamos de la oreja, ¿cierto? Todo va, it's below the jaw, in the line with might you tell us like the right location? Might you tell us might you describe the right?
Usually start with the right sensor B, onset of the neck. And sensor A, like about 5 centimeters for the neck electrode. Right.
Puede ir en cualquier lado, derecho, izquierdo, si está ocupado por catéteres o algo, y el uno va como en la base del cuello, ahí como en la línea de la oreja, y el otro 5 centímetros sobre él, a nivel casi que de la mandíbula. El otro es a nivel del cifoides. Entonces, con la línea del cifoides se traza pues como derecho hasta la línea medio axilar. Y ahí sería el puesto del electrodo. Y el otro de 5 a 7 centímetros debajo de este primer electrodo sobre la línea medio axilar también. Entonces está el negro arriba, luego sigue el blanco y abajo el verde y luego el rojo. Y con eso ya empieza la medición.
Buenas noches. Bueno, la idea sería ir poniendo algunos parámetros, poner en este caso el sexo del paciente, altura del paciente, peso corporal, edad del paciente, número de identificación, ID. No es necesario, pero es más que todo para el informe. Y necesitaríamos el parámetro de...
Yeah, but that can be done later.
Ok.
But you can
Entonces,
let's assume it's a normal blood pressure. For example, we say here just activated, let's say 120/8, and that's it. So height, age, gender.
Entonces, talla, peso, género y la identificación. Y presión arterial.
ahí puede ir diciendo lo que va viendo. Frecuencia.
La frecuencia cardíaca está en 71. El contenido del líquido pulmonar
23.
en 23. ¿Eso en qué?
Aquí según eso está un poco bajo.
Ok.
Él les da como la...
Los
Tiene,
valores de
En un
referencia.
valor
tiene
medio.
el verde,
Ajá,
¿cierto?
rango.
Eso, él tiene una escala que le va diciendo cuál está alto, cuál está bajo y cuál está en el rango. Eso es lo que también para no tener que sabérselos todos cuál está bien y cuál está...
We see a heart rate ritmo cardíaco of 68. So as the fluid content 23 is relatively low, so he has a very dry thorax. Maybe suggest something to drink occasionally. That means not coffee, okay, water or juice, so that you add something to your blood volume. We have a very good index of contractility, smack in the middle. Stroke volume variation on him is about 12%, which would indicate he doesn't need immediately volume. He's probably okay, but if this increases, he might need more. And the systemic vascular resistance of it's a little high, 2,820.
Diagnóstico está de guayabo el doctor. No,
So,
no, mentira. Según eso le falta un poco de volumen. El stroke, la variación del volumen sistólico está un poco alta. Miren, ahí subió a 20. Con un contenido pulmonar de fluidos disminuido. Cierto, con todos los demás parámetros, bueno, o sea, no es inmediatamente que necesita un bolo, pero sí parece que está deshidratado. Si decimos que, si le preguntamos, ¿y tiene sed? Pues no, podría decirnos, de verdad, ¿tiene sed o algo? Pues podría tener sed. Es una buena cosa, pues, como clínica, como una correlación clínica.
yeah.
O sea, ¿y el movimiento del paciente también lo altera?
Yeah, wait a sec. Okay, someone played with the device, so reconfigured the screen. We put now cardiac output. His cardiac output is 5.5 liters per minute as of now. Now, I told you the system is sensitive to motion artifact. You do little exercise for us to get your heart rate up, to get your cardiac output up? You can make 100 push-ups.
La cosa es que también, bueno, eso, lo vamos a poner a hacer ejercicio. Lo que dice el doctor Lema del cambio de posición puede ser chévere porque es como elevación pasiva de piernas, puede ser como una autotransfusión de 200, 300 centímetros que podría ayudarnos a ver si también está.
You're too well trained. So we see now a low signal quality. Just a low signal quality, but measurement cardiac output 9 liters
Wow.
per minute. Probably. Yeah, cardiac output.
Entonces, el gasto cardíaco con el ejercicio que hizo las sentadillas pudo aumentar el gasto cardíaco que estaba alrededor de los 5 a los 7, 8 y hasta 9 llegó el punto máximo. La frecuencia cardíaca también subió y conforme está en reposo en este momento ha ido bajando paulatinamente. Estaba en 9, ya va en 7.2. La frecuencia cardíaca subió a los 90, está en 88 y todos los parámetros pues se han ido como ajustando de acuerdo al estado de ejercicio. O sea que con un estímulo de aumento del gasto cardíaco, vemos que sí hubo un cambio asociado a lo que se espera ver en este tipo de cambios, ¿cierto? Háganos un favor, ¿podría acostarse y levantar las piernas para ver si cambia el... Sí, pues. Does the interface save like attendance in the patient, like graphs and this kind of information?
This monitor measurement every minute. This cost data. Research. You can connect this with, then you get more graphic. You get a graphic of like race test. Every
Okay, nice.
right now, wait. Right now we show. Let me get the. Right now.
Monitorea buena.
And Santiago lift volume.
Entonces vamos a ver, con la elevación pasiva de piernas, un aumento en el stroke volume es como lo esperado. También el TFC esperamos que suba un poco y que la variación del volumen sistólico también disminuya.
So after raising the legs, we see the stroke volume is about the same, 101, 102. So raising the legs and offering Dr. Munoz Hartz more preload, more precharger, didn't change his stroke volume. So giving more volume to his circulation wouldn't help. He would be a non-responder. So you can put the legs down. Thank you, Santiago. So this is basically the most recommended test to check a patient's need for volume without adding volume. I mean, think about an older patient whose heart might not be able to work with the additional volume. Thank you.
O sea, la idea es como que la elevación pasiva de piernas nos brinda la oportunidad de hacer una monitoría cardíaca para ver si necesita o no fluido, y si la prueba es negativa, pues podríamos decir que no necesita fluido para no irnos a inundar como el pulmón si no es necesario, si no es respondedor.
So if arrhythmia has, some it beats stroke volume, but the system is measuring. That's what we want to know.
Aprobado eso. Bueno, ¿alguien del auditorio virtual o alguna otra pregunta para aprovechar pues la... Bueno, entonces aquí estamos como tratando de verificar esto. Vamos a tratar de documentarnos pues como con lo que existe para tratar de tener otra idea más
Luis,
general, pero sí.
Una pregunta, es que veo que la tecnología está muy relacionada con la forma, la distribución, la movilidad de los glóbulos rojos. Quiere decir que en un paciente muy anémico o, por ejemplo, con anemia de células falciformes, ¿No sería el método de elección?
So he asked about the patients in the with anemia or with inborn hemoglobin alteration, like sickle cell disease. That might be another population that where this technology is not accurate, or what can you say about it?
Well, actually, that's what we thought too, that, for example, sickle cell disease would change or would make this cardiac output measurement less accurate. But we haven't done a study, but we have come across approximately 2 or 3 patients, and they didn't show, they showed a very good match with thermodilution. So can I say it works on every sickle cell patient with the same accuracy? No. But so far, we haven't seen any indication that sickle cell disease actually increases the inaccuracy of the system.
And in terms of hemodilution or polyglobulia, in this patient with severe dehydration or severe hemodilution or anemia?
We don't have data on this. So far, most of the studies were really about accuracy, comparing our system to thermolution, Doppler, ecosystem, or even flow track. And once this was cleared, studies went into using the parameters and doing classification for septic patients or other things. I really invite you, look at our website. There are 100+ publications. They are sorted for adult, pediatric, neonatal patients, and for different applications, anesthesia, cardiology, cardiac surgery.
Entonces, la cosa es como que tiene buena reproducibilidad. Ellos lo han probado en algunos pocos pacientes con anemia de células falciformes. La concordancia o la correlación fue muy buena, pero no pueden decir pues que se puede aplicar. O sea, se espera, o como la pregunta está diseñada para eso, sí que pueda tener alguna variación y que la precisión se comprometa, pero pues que eso no lo pueden decir, ni afirmar, ni negar, pero que en los que han visto no tiene problema. Igual como la pregunta del doctor Arisa, la reología o los cambios en la dilución de la sangre o la concentración de los glóbulos rojos tampoco parece tener un impacto muy grande, como en la medición comparada con las otras técnicas de medición que son las tradicionales. Pero por ahora, pues, hay varios escenarios en los que tocaría hacer más investigación, y hay muchos en los que sí están y que en el sitio web pueden encontrar, pues, como algunas de estas descripciones para mayor información. ¿Algún otro?
The technology was FDA market released in 2008, so about 15 years ago. It's our fault that we didn't come to Latin America, and I apologize for that. It's a beautiful country, especially Colombia. The main reason is nobody at our company spoke Spanish. Okay, and now we have my wife Marlene, who speaks as a Mexicana fluent Spanish, and now we're able really to communicate to distributors and physicians here. Yeah. Maybe last statement. I mean, you have seen how easy it is to use the system, okay? And within 2 minutes, with some experience, you get the measurements on a patient. Now, it works in the majority of all patients, maybe 95% of your patients. If you have any doubts, for example, that these numbers are correct, you can always apply a more expensive, not necessarily more accurate method and see if you get the same results. But we know from our physicians in Germany, United States, or in China, Japan, and Korea, and in many countries where we sell the system, offer the system, that once someone gets familiar and knows the system, and not only measures the very sick patients, but also measures the, let's say, only moderate sick patients to get an idea what the parameters means. They use the system only. We have a clinic, it's the Navicent Medical Center in Macon, Georgia, United States. They have used the system, I mean 8 of them, now in about 11,000 patients. They use the system in anesthesia in each and every case, no matter if the patients are young, medium old, or very old. And this experience basically tells them how to look at these parameters. Like with every monitoring method, you have to become a little bit familiar what it does. And why are they using this? They say, well, they start measuring before inducing anesthesia. And then during anesthesia, depending on the medication, cardiac output would drop sometimes by 50%, which they don't want. So they counter steer with inotropes to make sure cardiac output never drops too much. Because if it drops too much, then there is a problem. Then maybe the patient not fully intubated, the patient is still alert and becomes uncomfortable, and then it becomes a little messy. So they control cardiac output and during the entire anesthesia, and then, of course, compare the end results to the results before. And they use, and I should mention this too, with the device comes a very nice documentation software, which is an option. It runs, you can connect the monitor to it, and it shows very nice presentations, stores all the data. You can create, with this system, status reports, but with the computer system, even comparative status reports showing, before, medium, during anesthesia, and after. So very good for case studies, for education.
Oh, nice. Entonces también que tiene una muy buena aplicabilidad en los escenarios de anestesia, que hay algunos escenarios en Estados Unidos. En Houston, you say, mention, in Houston, is that experience with the intraoperative use, is in Houston? En Georgia, que en Georgia están haciendo más de 1,000 pacientes con esto y que hacen el monitoreo desde el principio en todos los pacientes y que han hecho como una estrategia de un protocolo para guiar las intervenciones en el intraoperatorio. Cosas pues a las que podríamos llegar y guiarlo de otro punto de vista, ¿cierto? Una monitoría invasiva relativamente no costosa, relativamente precisa, ¿cierto? Y que podría ayudar mucho en las cosas. Entonces, pues, la invitación, pues, como a conocer más, tratemos de explorar más este tipo sobre todo, a mí me parece importante en los niños que no tenemos ese tipo de monitoría. En los adultos, pues, usamos catéter arterial pulmonar, flow track, está validado, pero en los niños, este tipo de monitoría se queda corto y no tenemos como un lenguaje para hablar con la gente en términos de gasto cardíaco, variación del volumen sistólico o agua pulmonar. No tenemos nada de eso porque no existe la monitoría que esté cerca, ¿cierto? I'm telling them that about the children population is where we could have more applications here, because we don't have access to nothing to measure the hemodynamic profile in them. So this population is one of the, I mean, the application is for everyone above 700 grams. Okay, is that?
We have measured neonates in a study where we tried to get, a full spectrum of neonates. The smallest neonate was 490 grams.
Whoa.
Actually, the smaller they become, the leaner they are. That's almost better for the system than a very heavy adult where, there's a lot of fat tissue and little cardiac function. Neonates are almost ideal.
Wow. Yo pensaba que el dato era que los de niños desde 700 gramos, pero dice que han tenido experiencias desde casi menos de 600, 590 gramos, pues bebés muy pequeñitos, y que incluso es mucho más predecible en ellos porque la impedancia pues se mide más fácil porque tienen menos grasa que una persona incluso adulta. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Osipka. We are really glad for your presentation. Having you here is very, for us we are very lucky to have you here tonight, and we appreciate your time and for you to come here to do this talk to us. Thank you.